The coast road north of Greyport runs straight until it doesn't. Then it curves hard, and there it is, Harrow House. 3 acres on a cliff above the Atlantic. October. The kind of cold that has opinions. She's standing in the rain with a deed in one hand and a key that doesn't work in the other. The house is a ruin. Every window either cracked or gone. The porch sagging like it's already made peace with falling. The gutters hanging off the roofline like they gave up sometime last year and nobody came to collect them. But that's not the thing that stops her. There's a tower. Northeast corner. Old stone much older than the rest. And the door is bricked over. Not caved in. Not collapsed. Bricked over. Deliberately. Recently enough that the mortar is still darker than the stone around it. Someone sealed that door and walked away. She stands in the rain and looks at it. And she doesn't leave. The key didn't fit. Clara stood in front of Harrow House for the first time and tried the key 3 different ways. Upside down, sideways. The obvious way. Nothing. She stood there in the October rain with a deed in one hand and a key that didn't work in the other, staring at a front door that was swollen shut anyway. Looking at a house that hadn't been lived in for years, maybe longer, and thought, this is fine. This is completely fine. It was not fine. The porch had 2 boards missing. The gutters were hanging off the roofline on one side like they'd given up and were just waiting for someone to come collect them. 3 of the front windows were cracked. 1 was gone entirely, replaced at some point by a square of plywood that had since warped so badly it barely covered the opening. The paint, what was left of it, had peeled down to bare wood in long strips that curled away from the siding like the house was trying to shed its own skin. And the lawn. The word lawn was doing a lot of work. Chest-high goldenrod. Tangles of wild aster going brown at the edges. A stand of sumac that had claimed the entire left side of the property like it had plans. Clara put the key in her coat pocket. She walked around to the back. The back door opened with 1 solid push, swelled at the bottom, not the top. She filed that away. Made a note in the part of her brain that had been making notes like that since she was about 12 years old. The part Ruthanne Cole had built and furnished and kept running whether Clara wanted it to or not. She stepped inside. The kitchen smelled like old water and something else. Something settled and long-standing and particular to houses that have sat empty in wet climates. Not rot. Not quite. More like the memory of rot. Like the house remembered being damp and hadn't entirely let go of it. Clara breathed through her nose and looked at the ceiling. Intact, that was the first thing. The ceiling was intact. She crossed to the far wall and pressed her palm flat against it. Cool. A little soft in one spot near the floor, which was worth noting. But the wall above it was solid. She knocked twice, listened to the sound. Dense. Good. She walked every room on the ground floor the same way. Hands on walls. Eyes on ceilings. Boots testing the give of the floors. She was taking inventory the way Ruthanne had taught her, not looking at what was broken, not yet. Looking first at what was still there. What was holding. The house was holding more than it looked like it was. That was something. She pulled out her notebook, the small one she kept in her inside jacket pocket, and started writing. She had $200 in her checking account. She had a deed to a house with a demolition order on it. She had a key that didn't fit the lock it came with. She had 8 months. She also had the notebook. And she had Ruthanne, which honestly was more than most people started with. The last time Clara had seen her father alive, they had been sitting at his kitchen table at 7 in the morning. He was reading the paper. She was drinking coffee. Neither of them was saying anything. But it wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was the comfortable kind, the kind that takes years to build, the kind most people never get with their parents at all. He looked up at one point and said, "You sleeping okay?" She said, "Well enough." He nodded. Went back to his paper. That was 3 months ago. He was dead 6 weeks later. Heart attack. Fast. His doctor said he probably didn't feel much. Clara chose to believe that. The funeral was at the church in town. Small and quiet, the way her father would have wanted it. Thomas gave a eulogy that was technically accurate and emotionally absent, the verbal equivalent of a form letter. Renee sat in the front pew in a black dress that cost more than Clara's monthly rent and dabbed at her eyes with a folded tissue at the appropriate intervals. Clara sat 2 rows back and watched the whole thing and thought about her father at his kitchen table with his newspaper and his coffee and his comfortable silence, and she kept that thought very close, like a hand around a match in the wind. The reading of the will happened 10 days later. Frank Dowell ran the meeting. He was the family's attorney, had been since Clara was a child. An old, steady-handed man who wore the same brown corduroy jacket to every meeting and always smelled faintly of wood smoke. He read the document in his careful, measured way, and the short version was this: everything went to Thomas. The house, the savings, the small investments their father had made over 30 years of careful, unglamorous living. All of it. There was a provision for Clara, $10,000 in personal effects. Renee's expression didn't change when Frank read that part, but Clara saw something move through her eyes. Quick, gone, satisfied. Thomas looked at the table. Clara kept her hands flat on her knees. Frank was still reading when Renee leaned over and said something quietly to Thomas. He listened, nodded once, and reached into the folder in front of him. He slid a piece of paper across the table toward Clara. A settlement offer. $15,000. In exchange for Clara relinquishing any future claim on the Harding estate, the Harding name in any legal capacity, and removing herself from any proceedings related to the property. Clara looked at the paper for a long moment. No, she said. Renee's eyes went sharp. Clara, be practical. I am being practical. $15,000 is more than I heard you. Clara looked at her directly. No. Thomas opened his mouth, closed it. He had always been better at carrying Renee's decisions than making his own. Frank cleared his throat gently. There is one other matter. He shuffled his papers, pulled a different document from the folder. Your father held a small parcel separately, a property inherited from his father. It's been unoccupied for some time. He set the document on the table. He listed it separately from the estate with the notation that it should go to Clara. Thomas reached into his jacket, pulled out an envelope, slid it across the table toward Clara, in the same motion as the settlement offer, with the same lack of eye contact. Clara opened the envelope. A deed. Harrow House. 3 acres of land on the Maine coast, 20 minutes north of Greyport. She had heard the name growing up. Her grandfather's place. Her father had mentioned it occasionally in the distant, fond way people mention things they never deal with directly. She hadn't known the shape of it, hadn't known it was something she could hold in her hands. She folded the deed carefully and put it in her coat pocket, next to the key she'd found in her father's desk drawer the week before. A heavy old thing, grained with rust, no label, no explanation. She'd taken it because it was his, and she hadn't known yet that she'd need it. She stood up. Clara. Renee's voice was smooth and reasonable, the particular smoothness of someone who has decided this conversation is already over. You should think carefully. Clara put on her coat. I have. She left the settlement offer on the table. In the parking lot, Frank caught up with her. He walked quickly for a man his age, his corduroy jacket open to the October wind. Wait. Just one moment. He stopped beside her, looked around once. Then, the property has a county demolition order on it, issued 14 months ago. It's been in abeyance pending the estate settlement. He paused. Now that you're the owner of record, it transfers to you. You have 8 months to either bring the structure into compliance or it gets knocked down. At your expense, yes. He looked at her steadily. Thomas has known about this for at least 6 months. His attorney flagged it during estate planning. Clara was quiet. I'm not telling you what to do, Frank said carefully. I'm telling you what he knew when he signed that envelope. She nodded once. Slow. Frank put his hands in his pockets and walked back toward the building. Clara stood in the parking lot in the October rain and looked at the deed in her hand. 8 months. The house had bones. She didn't know that yet, but she was about to find out. Ruthanne Cole had been managing the Harding house since before Clara was born. Not in the formal, uniformed sense this was Maine. Not a period drama, but in the real sense. She knew where every circuit breaker was. She knew which windows leaked in a northeast wind and which door needed to be lifted while you turned the knob. She'd outlasted 2 renovations, 1 pipe disaster, and 30 years of a man who meant well but had no idea how a house actually worked. She was 62 years old and built like someone who had never once in her life wasted a movement. When Clara called her, she said, "When do we go?" They drove up on a Saturday. Ruthanne brought her own work gloves and a flashlight and a thermos of coffee and didn't say anything about the state of the property when they pulled up. She just got out of the car and walked around the perimeter first, the way you circle a horse before you approach it, assessing. Then she walked in through the back door the same way Clara had. They went room by room. Ruthanne's method was deliberate and systematic and completely quiet. She didn't narrate while she was assessing. She saved that for after. She moved through each space with her flashlight in her hands. The same inventory Clara had done, but older, deeper, with 30 more years of houses behind it. Clara followed and watched and took notes. In the kitchen, floor joists are good. You've got some sill rot on the north wall, but it's surface. The framing behind it is solid. In the dining room, someone put a load-bearing wall where they didn't need one in here. Waste of space. But it's not going anywhere. In the back hallway, plaster's cracked, but the lath underneath is holding. You don't touch this yet. Let it breathe. She stood in the center of the main room and turned slowly. Looked at the ceiling. Looked at the floor. Put her foot on the boards near the window and applied weight gradually, feeling the give. The bones are good, she said finally. Clara let out a breath she hadn't entirely realized she was holding. Very good, Ruthanne said. Whoever built this knew what they were doing. It's been neglected, it hasn't been abused. There's a difference. There's also a demolition order. I know about the demolition order. Ruthanne didn't sound alarmed. She sounded like someone who had dealt with worse than demolition orders and come out the other side carrying her tools. 8 months is enough time if you don't waste any of it. I don't have much money. I know. She looked at Clara. Not with pity. With the particular, unsentimental attention of someone calculating what's actually available. You have a good eye. You know what you're looking at. You know how to work. Those things cost more than money if you have to hire them. She paused. I'm also going to call Earl Briggs. Who's Earl Briggs? A man who knows this town and knows how to build things and doesn't talk more than he has to. She picked up her thermos. I'll tell him to come Monday. Clara looked around the room. At the warped window frames and the stained ceiling and the floors that needed refinishing and the walls that needed more than she could currently calculate. Ruthanne, she said. What? What am I doing? Ruthanne poured a cup of coffee, handed it to Clara. You're fixing a house, she said simply. Start there. She had told Clara things like that her whole life. Small sentences that did large amounts of work. Clara was 12 the first time she remembered sitting with Ruthanne in the Harding kitchen, watching her go through the household accounts with the methodical attention most people reserve for things that actually excite them. She'd said, You want to know how to read this? Clara had shrugged. I guess. Then look here. And Ruthanne had walked her through it, not the way a teacher explains to a student, but the way a craftsperson hands something to someone they think is worth the teaching, without condescension, without oversimplification. Over the years she'd taught Clara other things the same way. How to identify dry rot by the way a surface gives under pressure. How to read a structural report without getting lost in the jargon. How to look at a room and understand what it was trying to do before you decided what to change. How to make a column of numbers tell you the truth about where things actually stood. People will take a lot of things from you, she'd said once, when Clara was older and things were starting to shift in ways that were hard to name. A house, an inheritance, a room at a table, but they can't take what you know how to do. They can't reach in and pull that out. Clara had thought about that sentence many times since. She thought about it now, standing in the empty main room of Harrow House with a thermos cup of coffee and 8 months and not much else. She opened her notebook and started writing. Earl Briggs showed up Monday morning at 7:30 in a truck that was older than some of Clara's relationships and better maintained than most of them. He was 58 and built like someone who had been doing physical work his entire life, not the gym-built kind of big, but the functional kind, the kind that comes from actual use. He had a gray beard trimmed close and light eyes that moved over surfaces the same way Ruthanne's did, taking inventory. He shook Clara's hand, firm, brief. Then he looked at the house. They walked through it together, all three of them, Earl and Ruthanne and Clara, and Earl's version of assessment was even quieter than Ruthanne's. He barely spoke. He touched things, knocked on surfaces, crouched to look at joints and connections, stood in doorways and looked up at the frames. In the kitchen, he said, Sill's soft here. Has to come out. In the main room, he said, subfloor's good. You can save the hardwood if you work carefully. In the back hallway, he said nothing. He just nodded. They came to the north side of the house last. There was an addition off the original structure, or what had been an addition once, now so integrated it was hard to tell where the original stopped and the extension began. And off that, attached to the northeast corner, was the tower. It was not large. 2 stories at most. Built of older stone than the rest of the house. Dark gray and close-fitted. The kind of construction that predated the main building by at least a generation. It had its own door, or had once the frame was there, but the opening was filled in. Not with wood. With brick. Not crumbling brick, new brick. Well laid, tightly mortared, conspicuously newer than everything around it. Clara noticed it. Made a note. Earl stood in front of it for longer than he'd stood in front of anything else. He didn't say anything. He just looked at the bricked-over doorway, with an expression that Clara couldn't quite read. Something went through it quick and quiet, gone almost before it arrived. Then he turned and looked at the exterior wall of the tower instead, running his hand along the stone. Solid, he said finally. Foundation's good. What's behind the bricks? Clara asked. He kept his hand on the stone. Can't say without opening it up. But you have a thought? He looked at her then. Steady. Measuring. I have a thought, he said. But I'd want to see it first. He moved on to the next thing. Clara let him, but she wrote it down in the notebook. Tower. Brick. Intentional. Ask Earl. She underlined the last 2 words. That evening after Earl had left and Ruthanne was packing up her things in the kitchen, Clara stood outside by the tower and looked at the bricked-over door. The brick was clearly newer. Not new, not recent, but newer by decades than the stone around it. Someone had done this deliberately, carefully. They'd used good mortar. They'd done the joints properly. You didn't brick over a door that thoroughly unless you meant it. She put her hand flat on the old stone wall beside it, the way Ruthanne had taught her. Cold, dense, deep. The tower had been here a long time. Whatever was inside it had been sealed in by someone who knew what they were doing and wanted it to stay that way. She went back inside, made soup on the camp stove she'd brought because the kitchen range wasn't operational yet. Ate it standing up because she hadn't found a chair that was structurally reliable. Then she set up her sleeping bag in the small room, off the 2nd floor, landing the room with the best roof. The one where the ceiling was intact and the window, though single pane and drafty, was at least all there. She turned off her flashlight. She could hear the ocean, not loud, just the low, persistent sound of it, constant as breathing. She thought about her father at his kitchen table in the morning silence. She thought about Thomas sliding that envelope across the table without looking at her. She thought about the bricked-over door. She opened her notebook in the dark and ran her fingers over the page, feeling the indentations of her own handwriting. Then she put it away and lay down and let the sound of the ocean do what it had always done, which was make everything else seem slightly smaller and more manageable by comparison. The first week was an education in what she didn't know. She knew the theory. She had worked 4 years at a small restoration company in Portland, actual work, not administrative work, not project management in the abstract, but physical work, hands-on. Learning the difference between what a building looks like it needs and what it actually needs. She could read a structural report. She could talk to contractors. She knew the vocabulary and the process and most of the principles. But she hadn't run one herself. Not from the beginning. Not alone. So the first week was full of decisions that seemed small and turned out to matter. What order to address things in. Which problems were load-bearing problems, and which were cosmetic problems pretending to be serious. Where to put money first and where to wait. How to prioritize when everything needed attention and nothing could wait indefinitely. She made a list. Then she remade the list. Then she looked at her budget, what little of it there was, and remade the list again. Earl came every day. He didn't announce when he was coming, didn't ask for a schedule, just showed up when he said he would and got to work. He had opinions about the order of things, and he shared them when asked and kept them to himself when not asked, which Clara appreciated more than she could easily say. On Thursday of the first week, she found him standing outside again, looking at the tower. Just standing, not doing anything else. She went out and stood next to him. Earl, she said, you know something about that tower. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I might. Are you going to tell me? He looked at the bricked-over door. He looked at the stone. He looked at the mortar between the bricks, which was good mortar, dense and well mixed, the kind that holds for decades if you do it right. Not yet, he said. She looked at the side of his face. Okay, she went back inside. She wrote it down, Earl knows. Waiting. The building department inspector came on Friday. His name was Derek Paulson, and he was a county employee doing his job, which was to assess whether the property could be brought into compliance within the demolition order's timeline. He was not unkind. He was not hostile. He was simply a man with a clipboard making a technical assessment. He spent 2 hours walking through Harrow House with Clara and his clipboard, and a running list that got longer the further they went. "Foundation's actually good," he said, which felt like the first gift. "That's your biggest variable, and you got lucky there." He noted the sill rot, the electrical panel, which was original and needed full replacement, the plumbing, which was partially functional, in the way that things are partially functional when no one has looked at them in years, the windows, the roof, which had 2 sections where the decking had softened, the porch. "You've got a real project here," he said at the end, not unkindly, almost sympathetically. "I'm not saying it can't be done. I'm saying 8 months is tight." "I know," Clara said. "The electrical has to be your first priority. Everything else depends on whether we can pass inspection on that." She nodded. She'd already put an electrician on the list. He looked at her for a moment, at her work gloves and her notebook and the sawdust on her boots. "You're doing this yourself? Mostly. You know what you're looking at?" "Getting there." He nodded. He seemed to make some decision she couldn't see. "Talk to Gus Harlan," he said. "He's the county sheriff, but he also sits on the Historic Preservation Advisory Board. The tower on your north side, if that structure is old enough, and it looks old enough, you may be able to get it flagged for preservation review. That would complicate the demolition order in ways that might work in your favor." He left. Clara stood on the porch and wrote down Gus Harlan. Historic Preservation, Tower. She underlined Tower again. The person who showed up a week later without warning was not Gus Harlan. It was a man in a gray suit and clean shoes who drove a car that was too good for the road that led to Harrow House and parked it like someone who was accustomed to other people worrying about his parking. He was around 50, easy in his posture, with the particular self-assurance of someone who has won enough negotiations that he no longer needs to perform confidence. He stood outside and looked at Harrow House. Clara was on the porch replacing one of the missing boards. She saw him before he saw her, and she had a few seconds to take him in before he noticed her. The suit, the shoes, the way he was looking at the house, not at what it was, at what it occupied. The land, the view, the position on the coast. He turned and saw her, Miss Harding. He said it like he knew her name before he arrived, which he did, she realized. He had come here knowing. "That's right," she said. "Wade Garrison." He didn't offer his hand. Just said it, like a fact about the weather. "I'm a developer. I've been working on a project in this area. A few parcels." He looked at the house again, at the roof, at the windows. "This is quite a project you've taken on." "It is," she said. "I'd like to talk to you sometime," he said. "About options. Options for the property." He smiled. Pleasant, professional, empty, no pressure. Just a conversation. She looked at him. "Sure," she said. "Sometime." He nodded, got in his car, drove away. She watched him go. Then she looked at Earl, who had appeared in the doorway behind her at some point during the conversation. Earl was watching the car disappear down the road with an expression she'd never seen on him before, something between recognition and unease. It came and went fast. "You know him?" she said. "Not personally." He went back inside. She wrote it down. "Wade Garrison, developer. Came here knowing my name." She looked at the entry for a moment. Then she turned the page and went back to her list. On the 14th day, Ruthanne came back. She came on a Tuesday, which became the pattern Tuesdays. Ruthanne, with food and a critical eye and a talent for saying exactly what needed to be said and nothing else. She walked through the progress Clara and Earl had made, room by room, and said almost nothing until she'd seen all of it. Then she sat down in the kitchen, where Clara had got the camp stove going and managed something close to an actual workspace, and she drank coffee and looked at the notebook Clara had been keeping. "You've been sleeping here," she said. "Not a question. Most nights." "Good." Ruthanne set the notebook down. "That's the right call. You need to know this house in the dark." Clara refilled her cup. "Earl knows something about the tower. He won't say what yet." Ruthanne was quiet for a moment. "Give him time," she said finally. "You know too, don't you?" Ruthanne looked at her coffee. "Ruthanne, I know some things," she said carefully. "I don't know enough to tell you all of it. Earl knows more than I do." She looked up. "Let him come to it." Clara sat with that. She was getting better at sitting with things she didn't have full information on. The house was teaching her that, in its way, there were a dozen things at any given moment that she didn't have answers to yet, and the only thing to do was keep working, and let the answers arrive in their own order. The man in the gray suit came back, she said. Ruthanne went still. Yesterday. Just sat outside in his car for about 10 minutes. Didn't come in. Left. Wade Garrison, Ruthanne said. Clara looked at her. You know who he is. I know what he's been doing in this county for the past 18 months. Her voice was flat, even, the specific flatness of someone choosing words carefully. He's been buying land, quietly. Small parcels, private sales, nothing that makes headlines, all of it on the coast, all of it north of town. Clara was very still. He's been buying around you, Ruthanne said. Everything around this property. Everything he could get. She set down her cup. This parcel is the one he hasn't been able to get. The sound of the ocean came in through the kitchen window. Low and constant. Clara looked at the deed which she had pinned to the wall in the kitchen where she could see it from the camp stove. Just a piece of paper, her name on it. He'll make an offer, she said. He'll make several, Ruthanne said. He'll start reasonable and work up. And if I say no? Ruthanne looked at her steadily. Then he'll find another way to ask. Clara thought about the demolition order, about 8 months. About a county inspector with a clipboard and a growing list. She thought about Thomas sliding that envelope across the table. She thought about Renee's expression when Frank read the settlement amount, that quick, satisfied flicker. She thought they knew. They both knew about Garrison. They both knew about the land. They gave her this house not because they wanted to give her anything, but because they needed someone to own it on paper while Garrison made it impossible to keep. The house was the trap, not the prize. She looked at the deed. She looked at her notebook. She picked up her pencil and turned to a clean page. If that was the game, then she needed to understand the rules better than they did. She had 8 months. She also had Earl, who knew something about the tower he wasn't ready to say yet. And she had Ruthanne. And she had what Ruthanne had given her, which was this, the understanding that a house has bones, that bones are what matter, that everything else, the peeling paint, the missing windows, the bricked-over doors, and the demolition orders, and the men in gray suits who drive cars that are too good for the road, all of that is surface. Surface can be worked with. She started writing. Outside, the October wind came off the Maine coast and moved through the goldenrod and the wild aster and hit the old stone face of the tower, which had been standing in one form or another since before anyone currently alive could remember. It didn't move. The second month smelled like sawdust and cold coffee, and the particular kind of exhaustion that sits behind your eyes and doesn't move. Clara had stopped noticing the discomfort sometime around day 20. The sleeping bag on the floor of the upstairs room. The camp stove that took 3 tries to light every morning. The single working outlet on the ground floor that she ran an extension cord from, threading it through 2 doorways, so she could have a lamp in the kitchen after dark. These things had just become the texture of her days. You stop noticing what you live inside. What she noticed instead was the house. The way it shifted in the wind, a low creak somewhere in the south wall, that happened at the same point in every gust, reliable as a clock. The way the light came through the kitchen window in the late morning, at an angle that lit up the dust in the air and made the whole room look like something out of an old photograph. The cold that came up through the floors first thing every morning, before the camp stove had a chance to do anything about it, and the way that cold retreated room by room as the day progressed. She was learning the house the way Ruthanne had told her to. In the dark, in the quiet, at the edges of things. Earl arrived every morning at 7:30. Never a minute before, never more than 2 minutes after. He drove the same truck, he wore the same canvas jacket. He brought his own thermos and his own tools, and he got to work without ceremony and without requiring direction, which was one of the most useful qualities Clara had ever encountered in another human being. They had developed a rhythm, not discussed, just arrived at, the way rhythms do when 2 people are competent and not wasting energy on unnecessary communication. She stripped plaster. He rebuilt framing, she sanded. He plumbed. She asked questions when she didn't know something. He answered them without making her feel like she should have already known. She made decisions about order and priority. He told her when he disagreed and why, and was right often enough that she'd started factoring his disagreements in as seriously as her own instincts. It was the best working relationship she'd had since Portland. She didn't say that to him, but she thought it sometimes, standing in a half-finished room, watching him work with the specific focused ease of someone who has done a thing so many times it has become pure reflex. Gus Harlan came by on a Wednesday. He was the county sheriff. But the building inspector had mentioned the Historic Preservation Board, so Clara had called and left a message, and she'd expected paperwork or a formal appointment or at minimum some advance warning. What she got was a man in a sheriff's jacket knocking on the back door at 10 in the morning with his hands in his pockets and an expression like he wasn't sure yet whether this was going to be a problem or not. "Miss Harding," he said. "Sheriff." He looked past her at the kitchen, which had progressed significantly from the stripped-out hollow it had been a month ago. New wiring run along the ceiling, the wall studs exposed and assessed and partly reframed, subfloor cleaned and ready. "You're moving fast," he said. "I don't have time to move slow." He nodded. He was around 52, gray at the temples, a face that had spent a lot of time outside in Maine weather and looked like it. He had the manner of a man who made up his mind about things carefully and then stuck to it, which she respected. "You called about the tower," he said. "I did." She walked him around to the north side. He stood in front of the tower and looked at it the way people who know old structures look at old structures, with the kind of attention that is reading something. The stone, the proportions, the way it related to the rest of the building. "How old do you think it is?" she asked. "Older than the house," he said. "Lot older, probably. You get these on the coast sometimes. Pre-colonial or early colonial. Someone built a lookout. Someone built a signal point." He walked around to the east face of the tower, where the stone was darker and the mortar between the courses was a different color entirely, older, almost black in the gaps. "Someone who knew what they were doing built this. Can it be flagged for preservation review?" He looked at the brick-filled doorway, studied it. "If the structure dates to before 1820, yes. Possibly even before that, depending on the survey." He turned to her. "You'd need a structural and historical assessment. Licensed assessor. It takes time." "How much time?" 6-8 weeks for the report. Then the board meets monthly. 6 weeks. She did the math quickly. It was tight, but it was possible. If the tower got flagged for preservation review, it would complicate the demolition order, potentially suspend it, while the assessment was ongoing. It wouldn't solve the problem, but it would buy time. Maybe enough time. "I'll get the assessor," she said. Harlan looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at Earl, who was standing in the doorway behind Clara, not involved in the conversation but present. Something passed between the two men. Brief. Hard to name. "All right," Harlan said. He pulled a card from his jacket pocket. "Call me when you have the report." He left. Clara turned to Earl. "You know him. Everyone knows Gus," Earl said. "That's not what I meant." Earl looked at the tower. "No," he said. "It's not." He went back inside. Clara stood outside alone and looked at the old stone face of the tower, the mortar that was almost black, the precision of the fitting, each stone placed against the next, with a care that spoke of someone who understood that this structure needed to last. Someone had built this to endure. Someone else had bricked over its door, and Earl Briggs knew something about both of those someones. She was increasingly certain of it. She went inside and called the historic assessor. Frank Dowell came on a Friday with a folder full of paper and the expression of a man who has found something he wasn't looking for and is not entirely sure how to present it. He sat at the folding table Clara had set up in the kitchen, the first actual piece of furniture in the house. A victory she had marked privately, and he opened the folder and looked at it for a moment before he looked at her. "I've been doing some research," he said, "on the property history. Standard practice when there's a demolition order. I like to understand what we're dealing with before we go to county." And he turned a page. "The property has been in your family since 1987. Your grandfather acquired it in a private sale. Before that it was held by a woman named Helen Reed." He paused. "She lived here." Clara was quiet. "She lived here from approximately 1991 until 2008. 17 years. He set the page down. "There's no formal record of occupancy, no utilities in her name, no mail forwarding, nothing official. But there are property tax records that show intermittent payments made by her name, and then on her behalf. And there's a record of a contractor permit pulled in 2008 for minor structural work on the North Tower." "The bricking over," Clara said. "Presumably, yes." He cleared his throat. Here's the part I wasn't expecting. He pulled another page from the folder. There's a document filed with the county clerk in 2007, a notarized statement. It references personal property to be held in trust within the Harrow House structure and to be transferred to the legal owner of the property at the time of discovery. He looked up at her over his reading glasses. It's a bequest, essentially. Informal. But it was filed and notarized and it would hold up. Clara stared at him. What personal property? The document doesn't specify. It just says within the structure. He set the page on the table. Clara, I think there's something in that tower. She looked at the wall. Through it, in her mind, to the north side of the house and the old stone and the bricked-over door. Earl knows, she said. Frank looked at her carefully. What makes you say that? The way he looks at it. She thought about Thursday morning. Earl standing outside, the expression on his face that came and went too fast to catch. He knows. Frank closed the folder. There's one more thing. He paused. Renee Harding, your sister-in-law. He said it carefully, like setting something fragile on a surface. She retained a private researcher 18 months ago. Paid cash through a third party, but I was able to trace it. The research subject was Harrow House and its ownership history. The room went very quiet. She knew about Helen Reed, Clara said. She knew something about this property that made it worth investigating, Frank said. 18 months ago, which is 2 years before my father died. Yes. Clara sat with that, the full shape of it assembling itself in her mind. Renee 2 years ago, hiring someone to look into Harrow House. Not because it was worthless, because she thought it wasn't. And then her father getting sick, and Thomas inheriting, and the settlement offer, and the envelope with the deed. They hadn't given her a problem to solve. They'd given her a problem to occupy her, while they figured out how to get what was actually valuable before she could. Except they didn't know what was actually in there. They only knew something was, and Clara had already found the tower. She looked at Frank. How fast can you research the legal standing of that 2007 document? I've already started. Good. She stood up. I need to open that tower. Frank nodded. Closed the folder. I'd be there for that if it's all right with you. Saturday, she said. Tell Earl. Saturday came cold and clear and bright, the kind of October morning on the Maine coast that looks like a painting of itself. The light was hard and precise, and it lay across the front lawn of Harrow House in long strips, illuminating the progress that had been made. The goldenrod cut back, the porch boards replaced, the front windows reglazed, the gutters rehung. It didn't look like the same house it had been 6 weeks ago. It didn't look finished, not remotely, but it looked like a house that was being cared for, which was different from a house that had been abandoned, and that difference was visible in a way Clara hadn't expected. Something in the posture of it, something in the way it met the light. Earl arrived at 7:30, Frank at 8, Ruthanne at 8:15 with food she didn't ask permission to bring and a look on her face that said she'd been thinking about this morning for longer than just this morning. They went to the tower. Earl had his tools. He'd assessed the brickwork the day before alone. In the late afternoon, Clara had watched from a distance and he knew exactly where to start. The lintel course, the top row beneath the arch of the original doorframe. You work from the top down. You don't let the brick above fall onto the brick below. He started. Clara and Frank and Ruthanne stood back and let him work. The first brick came out slowly, with the careful deliberateness of someone who respects the material. Then the second. The third came out bringing a small cascade of mortar dust that hung in the cold air and caught the light. By 10 o'clock there was a gap at the top of the doorway, big enough to put a flashlight through. Earl handed one to Clara without being asked. She held it to the opening. The light moved through the gap and fell on a floor, clean floor. Not debris-strewn, not rotted. Clean boards, old but intact, the way floors are when they've been regularly swept. A table, a chair, a low shelf along the curved wall. Not empty, not a storage space, not debris. Someone's room. Someone had lived in this tower. The thought moved through her like cold water. Slow and complete. Keep going, she said to Earl. He kept going. By noon the doorway was clear. The arch of the original frame was intact beneath the brick old wood, darkened to near black, but solid. Earl ran his hand along it the way Clara had seen him run his hand along every piece of structural wood he'd ever assessed. He nodded once. Clara stepped through. The room was round and roughly 20 feet across at its widest. One window, narrow, set deep in the stone, facing east toward the water. The glass was old, not original, but old, the wavy kind that distorts light slightly, that makes the view through it look like something seen underwater. The table was small. Scarred wood, the kind of scarring that comes from use over years rather than from neglect. A single chair. A reading lamp, unplugged, its cord coiled neatly. The shelf held books fewer than 20, arranged without particular system, spines facing out. A cup, clean and empty, sitting on the edge of the table as if it had just been set down. And in the center of the table, set deliberately, wrapped in a piece of oilcloth and tied with twine, a tin box. Not hidden, not tucked away, placed. The way you place something you mean to be found. Clara's hands were steady when she untied the twine. She had expected them not to be. But her hands were steady and the oilcloth fell away and the box opened. The letter was on top. Handwritten. Several pages, close and careful script. The letters of someone who wrote by hand regularly and had particular habits about spacing and margins. Frank moved close to read over her shoulder. Ruthanne stood in the doorway. Earl stayed outside, which Clara understood without anyone having to say anything about it. The letter was from Helen Reed. She had moved into Harrow House in the winter of 1991, 6 months after her husband died. Her husband, Walter Reed, had known Clara's grandfather not well, but the way people know each other in small coastal communities, through decades of proximity and occasional necessity. When Helen had found herself with nowhere she could afford to stay, and no family close enough to matter, she had called the only person whose number she still had from that world. Clara's grandfather had told her, "The house is empty. It'll probably stay empty. You're welcome to it until things change." Things didn't change. She stayed 17 years. She paid taxes when she could, and in the years she couldn't, she wrote a note to the town office explaining and always, eventually, made it right. She kept the structure from deteriorating beyond what could be fixed. She did small repairs. She kept the tower. And when she felt the end coming, at the beginning of 2008, she'd called Roy Briggs, Earl's grandfather, a man she'd known through all 17 years, and asked him to seal the tower after she moved out of it for the last time. She'd moved into the ground floor of the house for her last months. She'd died in April of 2008, in the room off the kitchen, alone but not without comfort, which is not the same as being alone without dignity. The letter was to whoever found the box. "I have lived in this house longer than I lived anywhere else," she wrote, "and it has kept me better than any of the lives I'd planned for myself. I am leaving you what I have, because the person who finds this room will understand something about what it means to care for a structure that other people have given up on. Maybe that seems like a strange reason to leave someone your savings. But I was never a person who thought reasons needed to be conventional to be good." Beneath the letter, a notarized copy of the bequest document Frank had found in the county records. And beneath that, in a cloth pouch tied shut with a rubber band, money, cash, organized in rubber-banded stacks, each labeled in Helen Reed's careful handwriting with the year it had been set aside. Frank counted it while Clara held the letter and looked at the window, and the light coming through the old wavy glass and the view of the Atlantic beyond it, gray and wide and constant. $47,000, Frank said quietly. Clara kept looking at the water. $47,000. A lifetime of careful saving, set aside in stacks with the year written on each one, by a woman who had lived in this tower for 17 years and kept it the way you keep something you love. Ruthanne made a sound from the doorway. Not a word, just a sound. Clara folded the letter carefully and put it back in the box. She thought about Renee, about the researcher hired 18 months ago, about the shape of the plan give Clara the house, let the demolition order pressure her out, let Garrison make an offer she couldn't refuse, and then what? Search the house themselves? They hadn't known what was in here, only that something probably was. They'd thought they had time. They'd been wrong. That evening, after Frank had gone and Ruthanne had packed up, and Earl had done one more slow walk around the exterior before leaving, Clara sat alone in the tower. She'd brought the camp stove lamp up. The cord barely reached, but it reached. The room glowed softly. The window had gone dark with the late afternoon and now showed her a reflection of herself sitting at the table, pale and tired and not as undone as she'd expected to feel. She had the letter out again. She'd read it 3 times now. Each time she caught something different. The first time she'd read for the facts. The second time for the shape of Helen Reed's life. This time she was reading for the woman herself. Helen Reed had not been asking for anything when she wrote this. There was no plea in it, no apology, no explanation of why she hadn't had anyone to leave things to. She simply stated what she was leaving, and why, with the directness of someone who had spent a long time alone, and had learned that directness was the most respectful thing she could offer. The house has bones, Clara thought. Ruthanne's phrase. But Helen Reed had known it first, in her own way, had lived it, had kept these bones for 17 years without anyone asking her to, without recognition, without the deed that said her name. She'd done it because it was worth doing. Clara sat in the room Helen Reed had sat in for 17 years, and felt the weight of that settle somewhere in her chest. Not grief exactly, not quite. Something adjacent to grief. Something that felt like recognition. Ruthanne knocked on the doorframe. Clara looked up. She'd thought Ruthanne had left. "I thought you went home," she said. "I was going to." Ruthanne looked around the room. Then she pulled the second chair. There was only one, but she'd brought one from the kitchen, apparently, and sat down across the table. "Frank called me. Told me the number." 47,000, Clara said. "Yes." Ruthanne set her hands flat on the table. "What are you going to do with it?" Clara had been sitting with that question since 2 o'clock. "Fight," she said. Ruthanne waited. "Garrison's offer is going to come back. Higher this time. And if I say no, he'll use the demolition order. The building code violations, whatever leverage he has." Clara looked at the window, the black square of it, her own reflection. "He's been patient for 18 months. He's not going to be patient indefinitely." "No," Ruthanne agreed. "Frank thinks the 2007 document is solid. The bequest is legitimate. That means the 47,000 is mine legally." She paused. "It means I can hire a real attorney. Not just someone to handle county paperwork. Someone who knows property law." Ruthanne was watching her. "And I need to know what else Renee was looking for," Clara said. "Because I don't think she hired that researcher just on a hunch. I think someone told her something. Or she found something." "What kind of something?" Clara thought about it. Something that made her think Harrow House was worth more than it looked. The wind came off the water and moved around the tower. The stone took it and held it and stood, the way it had stood for more than a century before either of them was born. "There's one more thing," Ruthanne said. She said it carefully, the way she said things she'd been turning over for a while. "Earl needs to talk to you. About his grandfather." Clara waited. "He's been carrying it for a long time," Ruthanne said. "He didn't know if it was his to tell. But after today," she stopped. "He'll come by tomorrow. Let him do it in his own way." Clara nodded. After Ruthanne left, Clara sat in the tower alone for another hour. She read the letter one more time. Then she folded it and put it back in the tin box and closed the lid. She looked around the room. At the shelf of books. At the coiled lamp cord. At the single cup set on the edge of the table, as if Helen Reed had just gone to the kitchen for a moment and was about to come back. She hadn't known this woman, would never know her. But she understood something about her that felt close and clear and real. The way you understand something when you've lived inside the same circumstances long enough to recognize the shape of them. Helen Reed had been given nothing and had made something. Had been forgotten by the official version of the world, and had kept going anyway, quietly, and with competence and without apology. Clara picked up the tin box and carried it down the tower stairs and into the kitchen, and set it on the folding table. She made coffee on the camp stove. She got out her notebook. She wrote down what she knew, what she didn't know, what needed to happen next and in what order. The list was long, but it was concrete. And she had $47,000 she hadn't had that morning, and a legal document that said it was hers, and a tower that predated everything else on this property, and might just complicate a demolition order enough to matter. She also had the letter, which was, she thought, possibly the most important thing. Because the letter was proof that someone had loved this house enough to stay in it for 17 years, without a deed or a document or anyone's permission. Had kept it and tended it, and trusted that eventually the right person would come along who understood what that meant. Clara thought she might be that person. She wasn't certain. She didn't deal in certainty. But she thought she might be. She drank her coffee and looked at the notebook and started planning. The next morning, Earl came at 7:30, same as always. But instead of going straight to work, he set his thermos down on the kitchen table. He took off his jacket. He sat down. Clara sat across from him. For a long moment he didn't say anything. He looked at his hands, at the table surface, at a point somewhere between them that had no particular significance except as somewhere to look while he assembled words. My grandfather, he said, was named Roy Briggs. I know, Clara said. He looked up. Brief, then back down. He told me about Helen Reed when I was in my 30s. He'd kept it for 20 years by then. He said, he stopped. She was one of the most capable people he'd ever met. Said she ran that tower like a captain runs a ship. Everything in order. Everything accounted for. Every repair tracked and every problem solved before it became a crisis. He paused. He said your grandfather was a good man for letting her stay. He never told my father, Clara said. I don't think so. No. Earl's voice was even. Not apologetic. Just honest. Roy didn't know if your father knew. He thought maybe your grandfather had kept it private. The arrangement wasn't. It wasn't official in any way. There was no paperwork on your grandfather's end. It was a handshake. A phone call. He turned his cup around on the table. When she died, Roy sealed the tower. She'd asked him to. He said she was very specific about how she wanted it done. Which courses of brick. Which mortar mix. A small sound that was almost but not quite. A laugh. She'd drawn him a diagram. Clara looked at her coffee. He made me promise to look after the property, Earl said. Unofficially. Check on it when I could. Make sure no one disturbed the tower before the right person found it. He paused. He didn't define right. He said I'd know. And when Ruthanne called you, Clara said, I knew, he said simply. The kitchen was quiet. The camp stove ticked as it cooled. Outside, the late October light moved through the reglazed windows and lay across the floor in long pale strips. Clara thought about Roy Briggs, who had kept a secret for 20 years because a woman asked him to, and because he thought it was worth keeping, who had made his grandson promise to watch over something that wasn't his to watch over, technically, because the right thing and the legal thing are not always the same shape. Earl, she said. Yeah, thank you. She said it simply, the way Ruthanne said things. Without extra weight, he nodded. Once. Picked up his jacket. Garrison came back, she said, yesterday, while you were gone. Earl stopped. He sat outside in his car for about 20 minutes. Didn't come in. She watched Earl's face. He's going to make another offer. A real one. Earl was quiet. He had someone watching the property, she said. Or someone told him we opened the tower. Either way, he knows we found something. Earl put his jacket back on slowly. What are you going to do? Say no, she said. And then get ready for what comes after no. He looked at her for a long moment. The way he'd looked at the tower that first day, assessing, reading something. Okay, he said. And he picked up his tools and went to work. Clara opened her notebook and wrote at the top of a clean page. What comes after no? Then she started writing everything she knew about Wade Garrison. Everything Frank had told her. Everything she'd observed. The suit. The car. The particular way he looked at the land and not the house. The patience of 18 months of quiet acquisition. A man who had been patient for 18 months would not respond well to a second refusal. She needed to be ready before he stopped being patient. Because when Wade Garrison stopped being patient, she had a feeling he was not going to be polite about it. She needed the historic assessment on the tower. She needed Frank's analysis of the Helen Reed bequest. She needed to understand exactly what Renee had known, and when she'd known it, and where she'd gotten the information. She needed all of that before Garrison came back. He arrived at 4 o'clock that same afternoon. This time he came to the back door. He knocked. He waited. Clara opened it. He was pleasant. He was professional. He said all of the right things in the right order. He said he understood she was undertaking a significant project. He said he respected that. He said he wanted to make sure she understood that the market in this area was unusual, and that properties with the kind of exposure Harrow House had didn't often get the kind of offers she was about to receive. Then he said, $280,000. Clara looked at him, at the clean shoes and the gray suit and the patience that had started, just barely, to show its edges. She looked past him at the newly reglazed kitchen window, at the light coming through it, at Earl visible through it, working on the far side of the room, not looking in their direction, giving her the space to handle this herself. No, she said. Garrison's expression didn't change, but something behind it did, something settled. Miss Harding, you have a demolition order on this property. You have significant code violations. You have a timeline, that is. I know my timeline, she said. I'm trying to help you. I know what you're trying to do, she said. A pause, brief. You'll change your mind, he said. Pleasant. Still. Like someone who has said this before and been right. No, she said again, I won't. She closed the door. She stood with her back against it and looked at the kitchen, at the wiring run clean along the new ceiling, at the reframed wall, at the subfloor she and Earl had cleaned and refinished over 3 consecutive evenings. Earl was looking at her now. He'll be back, she said. Yes, Earl said. With something bigger than an offer. Probably. She pushed off from the door, picked up her notebook. Then we better be ready. She wrote 3 words at the top of the page. Get ready now. The October light moved across the floor, and the house breathed around her, and somewhere out beyond the north wall, the tower stood in the late afternoon shadow and waited. The way things wait when they have already outlasted everything anyone expected them to outlast. The letter from Garrison's attorney arrived on a Tuesday. Clara was on the roof when Earl brought it up. Not literally, she was on the section of porch roof she'd been redecking for 3 days, crouched in the cold with a nail gun and a stack of boards that kept shifting every time the wind came off the water. Earl appeared at the ladder with the envelope in his hand, and looked up at her with the expression he used when something required attention, but he wasn't going to editorialize about it. She climbed down. She opened it standing in the side yard with her work gloves still on. 7 pages. Garrison's attorney, a firm out of Portland with a name that took up 3 lines of letterhead. The letter cited 7 specific building code violations on the Harrow House property. It cited the active demolition order. It cited a provision in county statute that allowed adjacent property owners to petition for accelerated enforcement of demolition orders when a structure posed a hazard to neighboring parcels. Garrison owned the parcels on 3 sides of her. The letter requested she appear before the county board in 31 days or submit to a compliance inspection within 14. It was written in the specific language of people who do this for a living. Precise, exhaustive, designed to feel inevitable. Clara read it twice. Then she folded it and put it in her jacket pocket and climbed back up to the porch roof and picked up the nail gun. Earl watched her from the yard. Well, he said. We have 31 days, she said. To what? To be ready. She drove a nail. The sound cracked across the cold air. Call Frank. Frank Dowell came that evening. He read the letter at the folding table with his reading glasses on, and his expression doing the specific thing it did when he was working through the structure of a problem, very still, eyes moving, the occasional small movement of his lips, as if he was parsing language. It's aggressive, he said finally. Yes. The adjacent property argument is unusual. It's been used before but not often. Usually in cases where there's demonstrable hazard, a wall about to fall, active structural failure. The house isn't about to fall. No, it isn't. He set the letter down. But they don't need it to be actually hazardous. They need to argue that it might become hazardous. That's a lower bar. Clara sat across from him. What do we have? The Historic Preservation Assessment request is in. Gus Harlan expedited it after he saw the tower, which I wasn't expecting. But I'll take it. He opened his own folder. If the tower is flagged for preservation review, it creates a separate track. The county can't demolish a structure under preservation review without going through the board, and the board doesn't move fast. That buys us time. How much time? Depends on the assessor's report. Best case, 4 months. Worst case, the assessor says the tower doesn't qualify. Then we're back to 31 days with no buffer. Clara looked at the table, at the letter sitting there being what it was. The bequest, she said. Helen Reed's document. It's solid, Frank said. The notarization is valid. The county filing is legitimate. And the language is clear enough that I'm comfortable arguing it in front of the board. The $47,000 is yours. He paused. Clara, you need to retain a property attorney. A real one, not just me. Someone who does exactly this: demolition disputes, county board proceedings, easement arguments. I know, she said. The $47,000 covers it. Comfortably. She had known this was coming. Had known it since she opened that tin box and Frank read the number out in the quiet of the tower. She had $47,000 that a woman she never met had saved over 17 years specifically so that whoever was sitting where Clara was sitting could do exactly what Clara needed to do. She thought about Helen Reed setting those stacks of bills aside year by year, writing the year on each one, knowing she wouldn't be there when they were needed, trusting that someone would be. I'll call tomorrow, Clara said. Frank nodded, closed his folder. There's one more thing. She waited. Renee, he said, I've been looking at the financial records you're legally entitled to access, given your position in the estate proceedings. The transfers to a third-party LLC over the past 14 months. He looked at her steadily. Clara, the LLC is linked to Garrison's project. The transfers are substantial, and the authorization signatures. He paused. Two of them don't look right. Don't look right, she said. Your father's signature on the authorization documents. The ones that moved money from the estate accounts before the estate was formally settled. He set a page on the table. A copy of a signature. Then another page beside it. The same name, different shape. I've seen your father's signature on documents for 25 years. Clara looked at the two signatures. They were not the same, close, but not the same. Renee had access to the estate accounts during the administration period, Frank said carefully. Thomas signed off on the administrative arrangement, which means Renee had authority to process transactions. But she did not have authority to authorize transfers of this kind, and she certainly did not have authority to sign your father's name. Clara was very still. How much, she said. Across the 14 months. Approximately $63,000. In transfers to the LLC that is linked not directly, there's a ledger between them to the Garrison project. $63,000. Her father's money. Moving through paperwork she'd signed to Garrison's project that was designed to swallow Harrow House and everything around it. The room was quiet for a long time. Does Thomas know? She said. I don't think so, Frank said. The accounts she moved from were investment accounts he didn't monitor closely. His name is on them, but Renee managed the day-to-day. Clara thought about Thomas at that table in the attorney's office, his eyes on the surface in front of him. The way he hadn't objected to anything. The way he'd slid that envelope across the table without looking at her. He hadn't been a villain in that room. He'd been a bystander in his own life. She almost felt sorry for him. Almost. Okay, she said. She picked up Frank's copy of the signatures, looked at them one more time. I need you to document everything. Every transfer, every signature, everything that doesn't match. She set the page down. Can you do that? Already started, Frank said. She nodded. Then let's get ready for 31 days from now. The call from Ruthanne came at 7 the next morning. Clara was on her second cup of camp stove coffee and her first hour of notebook work, which had become the structure her days hung on: coffee, notebook, then tools. Think first, then do. Thomas is in Greyport, Ruthanne said. Clara stopped writing. What? He came in last night. He's staying at the inn on Harbor Road. A pause. He came alone. Clara sat with that. Thomas. In Greyport. Without Renee. Which was Thomas never went anywhere without Renee. Not in the last 6 years. Not that Clara had observed. Renee organized their travel, their schedule, their social commitments, their financial decisions apparently. Did he call you? Clara said. He called me, Ruthanne said. He asked if you'd see him. Clara looked at the wall. Through it, in her mind, to the north side of the house and the tower with its open doorway, and the room where Helen Reed had sat and watched the ocean for 17 years. Yes, she said. Tell him to come here. He showed up at 9:30 in a car she didn't recognize, a rental, probably wearing clothes that looked like he'd packed without thinking about it, which was unusual. Thomas had always been careful about appearance. Renee's influence, she had assumed. He looked tired. More tired than she'd expected. Not just lack of sleep tired, the other kind. She let him in through the back door. He stood in the kitchen and looked around at what the space had become. The new wiring, the reframed walls, the subfloor refinished under the folding table, and the 2 chairs, and the camp stove setup that was functional if not beautiful. He looked at all of it the way you look at something that surprises you by existing. You did this, he said. Earl and I, she said. Sit down. He sat. She poured him coffee from the thermos. He took it without asking what it was or whether there was anything else. For a long moment neither of them said anything, which was fine. Clara had learned to let silences run their length. Ruthanne had modeled that. Helen Reed had probably lived it. Renee doesn't know I'm here, Thomas said. I know. He turned the cup in his hands. I found something. In the account statements. He looked at the table. I wasn't looking for it. I was looking at something else entirely and I found it. He stopped. Started again. How much do you know? Some, Clara said. The transfers. Yes. He was quiet. How long have you known? Frank found it. Recently. Thomas nodded. The motion was very small. Did you know she hired someone to research this property? Yes. He looked up at her then, for the first time since he'd walked in. She didn't tell me, he said. Not the research, not the transfers. Not. He stopped. His jaw tightened. I thought she wanted to give you the house because she genuinely. He didn't finish that sentence. Clara looked at her brother. He was 38 years old, and he looked 10 years older than that this morning. And she had not, in a long time, seen him look like a person she recognized from childhood, from before. Thomas, she said. He looked at the table. What did you think she was doing? Clara said, not unkind, genuinely asking. I thought. He stopped. She told me the house was a liability, that giving it to you was the practical solution, that the demolition order made it impossible to sell and we'd just be stuck with the cost. He paused. She made it sound like she was doing you a favor. Clara was quiet. She was doing herself one, he said. Flat. Like a fact he'd been sitting with long enough that the edges had worn smooth. Yes. He set the cup down. I think she knew there was something valuable here. She didn't know what. But she thought that if you took the property on and couldn't handle it, couldn't deal with the order, couldn't finance it, then she could come in afterward. Through Garrison. He looked at his hands. I don't know all of it. I don't know how much she told him or what arrangements they had. But the money moved from our accounts to something connected to his project. He looked up. My father's money, Clara. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside, the November wind was starting to build. She could hear it in the eaves. That particular sound Harrow House made in a northeast wind, low and layered, like the building was breathing in. What do you want to do? Clara said. Thomas was quiet for a long time. I want to do the right thing, he said. I know that. He made a gesture that didn't have a clear meaning. I know that doesn't fix anything. No, she said, it doesn't. But I can tell you what I know. Officially, if it comes to that. He looked at her. The signatures, the transfers, the timeline. I can document what I know. Clara looked at her brother for a long moment. She thought about what Frank had said. About 31 days. About the county board. About Garrison's attorney and the 7 code violations and the adjacent property argument. She thought about what it would mean to have Thomas walk into that room. 31 days, she said. There's a county board meeting. Garrison is pushing for accelerated enforcement of the demolition order. Thomas nodded slowly. If you're going to do something, she said, that's when it matters. He was quiet for a moment. Then I'll be there. She looked at him. I'll be there, he said again, steady, like he was testing whether it sounded true coming out of his mouth and had decided it did. She nodded. Once. She didn't thank him. It wasn't a gift. It was a correction. A very late, very partial correction to a very large wrong. She wasn't going to treat it as more than what it was. But she noted it. He left an hour later. She stood on the porch and watched the rental car back down the drive and disappear onto the road. Then she went inside and called Frank. Thomas is in, she said. Frank was quiet for a moment. Reliable? I think so, yes. That changes things, Frank said. I know. She hung up and stood in the kitchen and looked at the wall and thought about what comes next. What always comes next, when you've done the thing you were afraid to do and it turned out to work, not perfectly, not cleanly, but genuinely you have to keep going. You don't get to stop and feel good about it. There's always more on the other side. She picked up her notebook and wrote, Thomas. Board meeting. 31 days. Then she turned to the next page and started making a list of everything that had to happen in those 31 days. The attorney Frank found was named Patricia Voss. She was 49, based in Augusta, had 22 years of property law behind her, and the particular manner of someone who has sat in a lot of difficult rooms and found most of them manageable. She came to Harrow House on a Thursday, walked through the whole property, the same circuit Clara had made the first day, and said nothing until she'd finished. Then she sat at the folding table and looked at everything Frank had assembled: the demolition order, the Garrison letter, the Helen Reed bequest, the historic assessment request, the signature analysis, and read it all the way through before she said a word. The bequest is your anchor, she said. The notarized document gives you standing to use those funds for the defense of the property. That's important. It means you're not just defending the house, you're executing the legal wishes of a prior party with documented interest in the property. Will that matter to the board? Clara said. It might. More importantly, it establishes a chain of care for this property that predates your ownership, which complicates the idea that it's been neglected. She made a note. The signature analysis is your leverage. Not for the board meeting that's a civil proceeding, not criminal, but it gives you something to hold. Against Garrison. Against Renee Harding, Patricia said, who has committed a crime, if the analysis holds, which puts Garrison's arrangement with her on very unstable ground. If his project relied on funds that were obtained fraudulently, his standing in county proceeding becomes complicated. She looked at Clara. I'm not saying this is simple. I'm saying you have more than you think you have. Clara thought about the tin box on the table in the tower, about Helen Reed's careful stacks of bills with the year written on each one. What do I need to do? She said. Patricia turned to a clean page in her notes. Tell me everything that's happened in order from the beginning. Clara told her. All of it. From the attorney's office and the settlement offer and the deed in the envelope. The first night in the house with the sleeping bag and the flashlight. The demolition order timeline. Earl and the tower and the bricked-over door. Helen Reed's letter and the $47,000. Garrison's visits and the offer and the attorney's letter. Frank's discovery of the signatures. Thomas in the kitchen 2 days ago. Patricia listened without interrupting. She made notes. Her pen moved steadily across the page and her expression stayed the same throughout, focused, absorbing, the face of someone building a structure in their mind as the material arrives. When Clara finished, Patricia looked at her notes. Okay, she said, here's what we do. The county board meeting was held on a Wednesday at 10 in the morning in the Greyport Municipal Building, which was a low brick structure from the 1970s that smelled like old carpet and heating system and the particular staleness of rooms that had heard a lot of difficult conversations. Clara arrived early. Patricia was already there, at the respondents' table, organizing her materials with the same systematic attention she brought to everything. Frank was beside her with his own folder. Earl had come but sat in the public seating, which was what Clara had asked present, but not at the table. Ruthanne was beside him. She had dressed up, Clara noticed, a dark wool jacket Clara had never seen before. The board was 5 people, 3 women, 2 men. The chair was a woman named Elaine Dodd, who ran the proceedings with the brisk efficiency of someone who had a lot to get through and believed in starting on time. Garrison arrived with his attorney and 2 other people Clara didn't recognize, associates probably. He was dressed the same as always. Gray suit, clean shoes, the pleasant professional expression. He glanced at Clara when he came in. She looked back at him without expression. The proceedings opened. Garrison's attorney presented the case for accelerated enforcement, the code violations, the adjacent property argument, the timeline concerns. He was good, organized, precise, making the case sound not like aggression but like reasonable concern for public safety. Patricia presented Harrow House's response. She started with the compliance progress, the electrical work completed and inspected, the structural issues addressed, the documentation of work done. Then she presented the historic assessment request for the tower and the preliminary findings from the assessor, who had confirmed that the tower's construction predated the main house by at least 60 years and possibly significantly more. She presented the Helen Reed bequest and its implications for the property's chain of care. She was better than Garrison's attorney. Not louder, not more aggressive, just more precise. The board asked questions. Clara answered the ones directed at her. Patricia handled the rest. It was going the way Patricia had said it would go, not a clear win, not a clear loss, a proceeding that would result in a determination that might give them more time. And then the door at the back of the room opened. Thomas walked in. He was alone. He'd driven from wherever he'd been staying. Clara realized she hadn't known he was still in Greyport. He'd said he'd be there and she'd believed him, and here he was, in a coat that looked like he'd slept in it, hair not quite right, standing in the doorway of the Greyport Municipal Building at 10:45 in the morning. Garrison saw him. Something moved through Garrison's face, not alarm, more like recalculation. Thomas walked to the public seating and sat down next to Ruthanne, who did not look surprised to see him. Clara looked at Patricia. Patricia looked at the board chair. If it pleases the board, she said, there is an additional party who has requested the opportunity to make a statement relevant to these proceedings. Elaine Dodd looked at Thomas. Is this party prepared to speak? Thomas stood up. Yes, he said. His voice was steady. Clara hadn't known if it would be. He stated his name, his relationship to the property, as a co-executor of the estate from which the property had been transferred. He said that in the course of reviewing estate financial records, he had discovered transactions he believed required disclosure to this board. He said the transactions involved funds from his late father's estate transferred to entities connected to the party seeking accelerated demolition enforcement of the Harrow House property. He said it plainly. No drama, no emotional color, just the facts in order. The room was very quiet when he finished. Garrison's attorney started to say something. Elaine Dodd held up her hand. "This board will take a 30-minute recess," she said. Clara sat at her table. She did not look at Garrison. She looked at her notebook, which was open in front of her, to a page she'd been writing on before the proceedings started. Notes to herself. Things she didn't want to forget. At the top of the page, in her own handwriting, bones. What's holding? She looked at those two words. The recess lasted 45 minutes. When the board reconvened, Elaine Dodd said that in light of the new information presented, the board was suspending the accelerated enforcement request pending a financial review. The demolition order itself was suspended pending the outcome of the historic preservation assessment of the tower. It was not over, but it was a suspension. A pause, room to breathe. Clara sat very still for a moment. Patricia put her hand briefly on the table beside Clara's, not on her hand, just beside it, close enough to register. When Clara turned around, Thomas was still in his seat in the public section. He looked exhausted. He looked like a man who had done one right thing and was still deciding what that meant. She looked at him for a moment. He looked back. She nodded once. He nodded back. That was all. Garrison stopped her in the parking lot. Just him. His attorney had gone ahead. He came around the side of his car and stood in her path, and he was still pleasant, still professional. But the patience had finally reached its limit. She could see it. "This isn't finished," he said. "I know," she said. "You're making this harder than it needs to be." "I'm making it as hard as it needs to be," she said. "There's a difference." He looked at her. The pleasant expression held, but the thing behind it had shifted. "The project I'm building here is going to happen," he said. "With or without that property. Good luck with it," she said. "Especially the parts that sit on financing that originated from a fraudulent transfer." The pleasant expression stopped holding. She watched it. The specific moment when a man who is accustomed to being the most patient person in a room discovers he isn't. "Miss Harding," he said. "Mr. Garrison," she said. She walked past him to her truck, got in, drove out of the parking lot. She did not feel triumphant. She felt like someone who had just carried something very heavy for a long time and had set it down briefly, but hadn't yet gotten to rest, because there was more to carry and she knew it. But she also felt something else, underneath the weight of it, something small and solid and persistent. She'd held the line. She thought about Helen Reed, who had held it for 17 years without anyone knowing, without anyone watching, without anyone in her corner or at a table beside her, or driving away from a parking lot feeling whatever this was. Clara drove north on the coast road with the Atlantic on her left, gray and wide and moving. She drove with the window cracked, even though it was November and cold, because she needed the air. The specific Maine coast November air that smelled like cold salt and pine, and the beginning of the season that would test everything. She drove all the way back to Harrow House and parked in the side yard and sat in the truck for a moment before getting out. The tower was visible from where she sat. Old stone, dark gray, standing at the northeast corner of the property with the sky behind it going white at the horizon where the weather was building offshore. It had been here before the house. Would probably outlast the house by another century if someone kept caring for it. She got out of the truck. She went in through the back door, put the kettle on, got out her notebook. She wrote at the top of the page, "What's next?" And she started writing. Because there was always a next. There was always more to do, and more to figure out, and more ground to hold. And she had learned, over the course of 4 months in this house, that the point was not to reach the moment where there was nothing left to do. The point was to be the kind of person who keeps doing it. Who gets up and makes the coffee and opens the notebook and writes the list and picks up the tools and works. That was what Helen Reed had understood. That was what Ruthanne had always been trying to tell her. You don't build a home in a day. You don't hold ground in a single morning. You do it over and over, day after day, season after season, in the cold and the wet and the exhaustion, until the doing of it becomes who you are. Outside, the November wind came off the water and moved around the tower. And the tower, as it always did, simply stood. December came in the way Maine Decembers always do. Not with drama, not with announcement. Just cold that arrived before sunrise and stayed past dark, and whined off the water that found every unfinished gap in every wall, and light that gave up at 4 in the afternoon like it had somewhere better to be. Clara had lived through Maine Decembers before. Not like this one. Not inside a house that was still deciding what it wanted to be. The camp stove, the extension cord lamp, the sleeping bag that had migrated from the upstairs room to the tower sometime in November because the old stone held heat better than anything else on the property. Dense and close-fitted, it absorbed warmth from the small electric heater and gave it back slowly through the night, the way things give back what they've been trusted with. Helen Reed had slept in this room. Clara thought about that sometimes. Not often. But in the early mornings before she got up, lying in the sleeping bag looking at the curved wall and the narrow window going pale with the first light, Helen had looked at this same wall, this same window, had watched this same light arrive for 17 winters, and had not found it insufficient. She got up, made coffee on the camp stove, opened the notebook. The county's financial review had been running for 3 weeks. Patricia had filed everything. Frank had assembled the signature analysis, the transfer records, the LLC connection traced back through 2 layers of holding companies to Garrison's project. Reviews like this were not fast, but they were happening, which was more than Clara had expected from a board that had initially seemed to be running on Garrison's clock. Thomas had submitted his statement in writing, formal, documented, notarized at Patricia's insistence. Renee had retained her own attorney, a firm out of Bangor, and had stopped answering Thomas's calls sometime in the 3rd week of November. Clara knew this because Thomas had sent one email to tell her, not asking for anything, just informing. She had not responded yet. She was still deciding what she wanted to say, which was different from not knowing. She knew some of it. She just wasn't ready to put it in words and send it somewhere it couldn't be taken back. She drank her coffee and looked at the notebook and made the list for the day. Patricia called at 8:30. Clara was on the porch replacing the last section of damaged railing. Her knees had opinions about kneeling on cold boards, but the porch had to be finished before the compliance inspection, which was 2 weeks out. She was not going to lose a compliance inspection on something she could have handled in a Tuesday afternoon. She set down the railing piece and picked up the phone. "The financial review is done," Patricia said. Clara straightened slowly. "And?" "The board accepted the findings. The transfers are confirmed as unauthorized. The authorization signatures are confirmed as not matching the documented signatory." A pause, not for effect but for precision. Patricia always paused for precision. "Renee Harding has been referred to the county DA's office." Clara stood on the porch in the December cold and looked at the yard, at the goldenrod she'd cut back in October, now flattened under frost, at the front path she'd cleared and re-gravelled, at the house itself, which did not look like the same house she had stood in front of 4 months ago with a key that didn't fit, and $200 and 8 months she didn't know yet how to use. Not triumph. Not exactly. Something quieter than that. The feeling of a thing that has been wrong for a long time being formally named as wrong, which doesn't fix it, doesn't undo the original injury, but matters, in the way that being believed matters, in the way that the record being accurate matters, even when no one is watching. "What does this mean for the demolition order?" she said. The board voted to suspend it indefinitely pending the outcome of the criminal referral. Patricia's voice shifted slightly, the way it did when she was moving to something she considered important. "And Clara, the assessor's preliminary report came through this morning. Gus Harlan called me directly after he received it. He expedited the review process 3 weeks ago, apparently. Didn't tell either of us he was doing it." Clara thought about Harlan at the tower in October, the way he'd run his hand along the darker stone, the mortar that was almost black, the way he'd looked at it, like he was reading something. "What did the report say?" she said. "The tower is being flagged for full preservation review. Construction dates to approximately 1778, possibly earlier." "A beat," Harlan said, and I'm quoting him directly here, he said. "That's not a building, that's a document." He meant it as a compliment. 1778. Before the main house by 60 years. Before this county had its current name. Before most of the roads that led to it had been cut, someone had stood on this cliff in 1778 and laid stone against stone with the kind of care that assumes the future is worth building for. During preservation review, Patricia said, the county cannot demolish the structure. And because the tower is structurally integrated with the north addition, which is integrated with the main house, they cannot demolish any part of the property without completing the review first. How long is the review? 4 to 6 months, by which time you will have passed the compliance inspection and the demolition order will be functionally moot regardless. She paused one more time. The order cannot be executed. Garrison's standing in county proceedings is compromised by the financial referral. His project is on hold. Another pause. You held it, Clara. The central things. The ones that mattered. Clara looked at the tower. Old stone, dark gray, standing at the northeast corner of the property with the white December sky behind it. The mortar between the courses catching the flat morning light. She thought about Patricia saying, "Thank Helen Reed, the bequest was the anchor." She thought about those careful stacks of bills with the year written on each one. 17 years of setting something aside for someone you would never meet, trusting that the right person would eventually need exactly what you had saved. "Thank you," Clara said. "Call Frank," Patricia said. "He should hear it from you." She hung up. She stood on the porch for another minute. Then she picked up the railing piece and went back to work, because the porch still needed finishing, and the morning was not going to wait for her feelings to finish their business. She called Frank from the kitchen at noon. He picked up on the second ring, which meant he was at his desk, which meant he had probably already heard from Patricia, and was waiting. "You know," she said. "Patricia called me at 9, he said. "I've been sitting here trying to decide if I should call you first or let you have it from her." "You let her have it." "She earned the call," he said simply. "She did the heavy lifting in that room." Clara leaned against the kitchen counter. The counter she and Earl had re-leveled in November, resurfaced last week. She ran her thumb along the edge of it. "Frank," she said. "Yes. You told me about the demolition order in the parking lot, the day of the will reading. You didn't have to do that." He was quiet for a moment. "No," he said. "I didn't. You could have lost the account. I'd worked for your father for 25 years, he said. I knew what he would have wanted. He would have wanted you to know what you were walking into." A pause. He didn't know about the demolition order when he wrote the notation in the will. He just knew you were the right one for the property. He couldn't have anticipated what Thomas and Renee would do with the estate administration. "But you anticipated it." "I suspected," Frank said. "There's a difference." Another pause, shorter. "I'm glad it worked out the way it did. I'm glad the record is accurate now." Clara looked at the wall, threw it in her mind to the tower on the north side, to the east window, to the desk where Helen Reed had sat for 17 winters, watching the same light come through the same old glass. "Come by sometime," she said. "I'll make actual coffee. In an actual pot." He laughed. "Small and genuine. I'll take you up on that." She hung up. She stood in the kitchen for a moment, not thinking about anything particular, just standing in a room that was hers, in a house that was staying, with the December light coming through the reglazed windows and lying across the refinished floor in long pale strips. Then she got back to work. Earl came by that afternoon without being called. He did that sometimes. Showed up when something had shifted, when the situation had changed in a way that seemed to find him through whatever frequency competent people used to stay informed without asking. He came in through the back, the way he always did, and stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at her. "Heard from Gus Harlan," he said. "Patricia told me," Clara said. "He expedited the assessment." Earl nodded. "He's been on the preservation board for 11 years. He knows what he's looking at." He said it was a document. Earl looked out the window toward the north side of the property. His profile was still, the way it got when he was thinking about something he'd been carrying for a while. "My grandfather built things to last," Earl said. "He used to say a wall that holds is a wall that says something. About who built it and why." He turned back to her. "He built that brick wall to hold until the right time. Set every course level. Keyed it every third. Good mortar, the right mix, a beat. He took his time with it." Clara looked at him. He was protecting it. Both things, Earl said. Protecting what was inside, and protecting the tower itself. Making sure nobody went in there casually. Nobody who wasn't looking for a reason to find it. Clara thought about that. About Roy Briggs in 2008, An old man with good tools and a promise to keep building a wall with the care you give to something that matters, not knowing who would eventually take it apart, trusting that whoever did would have a reason worth the trouble. Earl, she said. Yeah, thank you. For showing up that first day. For staying. He looked at her with the directness he brought to everything. Not deflecting. Not dismissing. Just receiving it cleanly, the way he received everything. Your grandfather was a good man, he said. It seemed right. He picked up his jacket. South wall trim in the main room still needs the corner pieces. I'll be back Thursday. He left. Clara stood in the kitchen and thought about the specific texture of loyalty that doesn't announce itself. That just shows up at 7:30 and does the work and doesn't require acknowledgement to keep doing it. She thought her grandfather had probably known that about Roy Briggs. She thought Ruthanne had probably known that about Earl. Some things get passed down the right way, even when the people doing the passing don't have words for what they're passing. Ruthanne came on Saturday, not Tuesday, which told Clara something. Ruthanne did not change her schedule without reason. She brought a thermos of real coffee, not the camp stove variety, and sat across from Clara at the folding table that had become, by default, the kitchen table, and looked at her for a long moment before saying anything. You look different, Ruthanne said. I'm tired, Clara said. No. Ruthanne shook her head slightly. Tired is what you looked like in week 2. This is different. She poured coffee into both cups. You look like someone who's stopped waiting for the floor to drop. Clara thought about that. It was accurate. She hadn't noticed the moment it had stopped the constant background hum of waiting for the next bad thing, the next letter from Garrison's attorney, the next call from Frank about something she hadn't anticipated. It had quieted somewhere in the last few weeks. Not because the threat had passed, but because she had learned, somewhere in the work of 4 months, that she could handle what came. You stop fearing the floor when you've tested it enough times. Ruthanne, she said. Did my grandfather know about all of it? Helen Reed, the tower, the documents she filed. He knew about Helen, Ruthanne said. He knew she'd been there. He knew Roy had sealed the tower at her request. He didn't know about the money or the bequest document that was Helen's business, and she kept it private. She turned her cup around on the table. He knew the property had something worth protecting. That's why he left it to you specifically. He could have left it to Thomas. Thomas would have sold it, Ruthanne said. Not unkindly. Just as fact. Your grandfather knew that. He watched both of you grow up. He knew which one of you understood what a structure was for. Clara looked at her hands. At the calluses that had built up over 4 months in ways she hadn't fully tracked. Her hands looked like someone who worked with them. They looked like Ruthanne's hands a little, like her father's hands a little. She didn't know when that had happened, but she was glad it had. Thomas sent an email, Clara said. Ruthanne waited. 1 sentence. He said my father would have been proud. She looked at the table. I haven't answered. I know, Ruthanne said. He told me. Clara looked up. He's still in Greyport, Ruthanne said. He's been staying at the inn. He doesn't know what to do next, and he doesn't have anyone to ask. She paused. That's not your problem to solve. I want to be clear about that. But I thought you should know. Clara sat with that for a moment. Thomas in a room at the inn on Harbor Road, with no Renee and no script and no next move prepared. The picture was both difficult and, she had to admit, something she recognized. She had been in the equivalent of that room, figuratively, on the morning she drove to Harrow House for the first time. Nowhere to go except forward into something she didn't have a map for. Do you forgive him? Ruthanne said. Clara thought about it honestly. Not the answer she was supposed to give. The honest one. I don't know yet, she said. I think what he did in the board meeting was real. He didn't have to do that. He knew it would end his marriage and he did it anyway. She paused. But he also stood in that attorney's office and let Renee run the whole thing. He slid that envelope across the table without looking at me. He knew about the demolition order and said nothing. Yes, Ruthanne said. So it's both things, Clara said. And I don't know yet how to hold both things at the same time and come out somewhere. Ruthanne was quiet for a moment. You don't have to come out somewhere today, she said. You're allowed to just hold both things and keep going. The somewhere happens on its own timeline. Clara thought about Helen Reed's letter, about the sentence near the end, I am leaving you what I have, because the person who finds this room will understand something about what it means to care for a structure that other people have given up on. Maybe that seems like a strange reason to leave someone your savings. She had understood it immediately when she read it. She understood it more now. Some things require patience that has no guaranteed return. You do them because they're worth doing, because the doing of them says something about who you are, regardless of what you get back. I'll write back to him, she said finally. Not today, but I'll write back. Ruthanne nodded once, picked up her coffee. Forgiveness isn't the point, Clara said. I don't think I'm at forgiveness. I don't want this to be the only thing we ever are to each other. The people who ended up on opposite sides of a thing that shouldn't have been a fight at all. She looked at the window. He's my brother. That's not nothing. It's also not everything. No, Ruthanne said. It's not everything. But it's a place to start from. They sat in the December quiet of the kitchen and drank their coffee, and the house settled around them in the way houses settle when they're warm inside and cold outside. A slow, patient sound like something breathing steadily in its sleep. Gordon Reed found her on a Thursday. She was in the tower in the early evening, working through the compliance inspection checklist by lamplight, when she heard the knock at the back door. She went down. The man on the porch was 57 or so, medium height, with a face that had spent considerable time outdoors and showed it in the lines around his eyes. He was holding the Greyport local paper folded open to page 4, where a brief article about the county board meeting had run 2 weeks prior. Her name was in it. The article was factual and dry and said almost nothing about the human shape of what had happened. Apparently it had been enough. Miss Harding, he said. My name is Gordon Reed. I think my great-aunt, I believe she lived here. On your property. Clara looked at him for a moment. She thought about Helen Reed's letter, about the line near the end, I have no family close enough to matter. She thought about what that sentence had cost to write. The specific loneliness of arriving at a point in your life where that sentence is accurate and you have to put it down on paper. Come in, she said. He came in slowly. He looked at the kitchen the way people look at places they've been trying to picture from second-hand information, adjusting the picture in real time, matching it against whatever he'd built in his mind. He took in the work, the new wiring, the re-leveled counter, the floor that had come out better than expected. She lived here for 17 years, Clara said, from 1991 to 2008. I didn't know, he said, how long she'd been here, or I lost touch with her after my uncle died. There was distance, geography, the usual reasons that turn out not to be reasons at all when it's too late. He looked at the folding table. I should have looked harder. I know that. You're here now, Clara said. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted slightly. Not absolved, he didn't strike her as a man who let himself off hooks easily but steadied, like a hand finding a surface in the dark. Is there the article mentioned a tower, he said carefully. Do you want to see it? Yes. A pause. If that's all right, she led him up. The tower room looked the same as it had the day they'd opened it. She had moved the tin box to a safer location, and her lamp was on the table now, and she'd brought the small electric heater up weeks ago. But otherwise she'd left it as Helen had left it. The table, the chair, the shelf of books, the single cup on the edge of the table, clean and empty. The east window with its old wavy glass that made the world outside look like something seen through still water. Gordon Reed stood in the doorway. He didn't step in immediately. He stood at the threshold and looked at the room for a long time, long enough that the silence became its own kind of language. Clara stayed back. This was not her moment. Then he stepped in. He moved to the bookshelf first, ran his fingers along the spines without pulling any of them out, reading the titles softly under his breath. He stopped at one she couldn't see which and held his finger there. She gave me this book, he said, when I was about 12. I didn't appreciate it then. He didn't take it from the shelf, just held his finger at the spine, like marking a place. She was always giving people things they didn't know they needed yet. He moved to the window, stood in front of the old wavy glass and looked at the dark December Atlantic beyond it. The last of the light was going, the horizon a line of pale gray between two shades of dark. She loved looking at water, he said. Even when she had a house in town, she'd find the highest window, stand there for a long time. He looked at the chair. She must have sat right here, every day, Clara said. 17 years. He turned from the window. Was she, do you know if she was... He stopped. I keep trying to ask whether she was happy, and I don't know if that's the right word. Clara thought about the room, about the cup set on the edge of the table, as if she'd just stepped out. About the books organized in no particular system, except proximity to whatever she'd been reading most recently, which was its own kind of order. About the careful stacks of money with the year written on each one. The decades of setting something aside with patient faith that it would eventually matter. I think she was settled, Clara said. I think she knew who she was and where she was and what she was doing and why. And I think that's the thing people are actually asking about when they ask if someone was happy. Gordon Reed looked at her. I think she chose this, Clara said. Not because she had no other options. Because this was the thing that fit. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his jacket pocket and took something out. A photograph. He held it out to her. She took it. Helen Reed. Younger, mid-40s maybe. Early 50s. Standing in a doorway somewhere Clara didn't recognize. Laughing at something outside the frame. Genuinely laughing. The kind of laughter that can't be performed. One hand on the doorframe. The light coming in at an angle and finding her face and catching there. She was beautiful in the photograph in the way that presence is beautiful. Not the face but the whole person behind it. The specific aliveness of someone who is exactly where they want to be. She was happy then too, Gordon said. Before all of it. I want you to know that. She had a full life. This wasn't she didn't end up here because she ran out of options. She chose it. He paused. Well, that's what I've decided to believe, because it's probably true and because I need it to be. Clara looked at the photograph. Helen Reed, laughing, one hand on a doorframe, the light finding her. It is true, Clara said. You can tell in a space when someone was at home in it. Not visiting, not surviving. At home, she looked around the room at the cup, at the window, at the books with his finger's ghost still hovering at one spine. She was at home here. He nodded. He looked at the photograph in her hands for a moment. Keep it, he said. If you want it, she'd have wanted you to have something. Are you sure? She left you $47,000, he said. Something in his voice that was not quite amusement and not quite grief, but the place where those two things live next to each other. I think a photograph is the lesser gift. Clara looked at the photograph one more time. Then she set it carefully on the table, in the lamplight facing the east window. Thank you for coming, she said. Thank you for leaving it this way. He gestured at the room, all of it, for not changing it. She walked him back down and out and stood on the porch and watched his car go carefully down the frost-edged drive. Then she went back up to the tower. She sat at the table, the lamp on. The photograph of Helen Reed facing the window, facing the dark beyond it where the ocean was doing what it had always done. Moving. Constant, regardless. She sat there for a long time without the notebook, without the list. Just sitting in a room where someone had been genuinely alive for 17 years and had left something of that aliveness behind in the arrangement of ordinary objects, the way the chair faced the window, the way the cup sat at the edge of the table, like any moment she'd be back for it. Clara was not a person who cried easily or often, but she sat in that room in December and let herself feel the full weight of it, not grief for Helen Reed, who had lived exactly the life she'd chosen, but something else, something like gratitude. For the chain of it, for Roy Briggs who had built the wall carefully because he'd made a promise to someone he respected, for Earl who had carried the secret faithfully and known when to let it go, for her grandfather who had made a phone call in 1991 and said, "Stay as long as you need," and had meant it, for a woman she would never meet who had set aside money year by year with the patient faith that it would find the right hands. For the whole long sequence of people doing the right thing quietly, without audience, because it was worth doing. She sat until the lamp was the only light in the room. Then she wiped her face and straightened and reached for the notebook. She did not open it to a list. She opened it to a blank page and wrote one sentence. Some things get passed down the right way. Then she closed it. The compliance inspection happened on a Tuesday in the second week of December. Derek Paulson arrived at 9 with his clipboard and his practiced neutral expression and walked through Harrow House from the basement to the tower with the systematic thoroughness of a man who has been fooled by surface improvements before and doesn't intend to be fooled again. He tested the electrical at every outlet. He checked the panel. He walked the structural elements that had been flagged in the original assessment and applied pressure to joints and connections with the professional skepticism of someone who needs to be convinced. He went through the roof section, over the back addition, the last structural item on her list, finished 3 days before this appointment. He walked the porch, he checked the windows. Clara followed him and said almost nothing. She had learned, over 4 months of decisions and negotiations, and a county board proceeding, that the most powerful thing you can do in a room where you've done the work is let the work speak for itself. You don't explain it. You don't apologize for what isn't done yet. You let it be what it is. Paulson finished in the tower. He stood in the circular room and looked at the curved walls and the east window and the stone that had been here since 1778. Maintained for 17 years by a woman whose name he probably didn't know, and then maintained for 4 more months by a 23-year-old who had arrived with $200 and a key that didn't fit. He wrote something on his clipboard. Then he looked at her. "You did this in 4 months. 4.5, she said. He looked around the room one more time. At the work. At the care that is visible in the work when someone has taken the time to do things correctly. At the difference between a structure that has been repaired and a structure that has been tended. I've been doing this job for 18 years, he said. I've walked through a lot of properties in a lot of conditions." She waited. "This is good work," he said. He signed the inspection report. He handed her a copy. He left. Clara stood alone in the tower, holding the signed report, and looked at the east window, at the pale December light coming through the old wavy glass and laying itself in distorted strips across the floor. Good work. She thought about the first morning. The key that didn't fit, the porch with the missing boards and the gutters hanging off the roofline, and the smell of old water and settled damp, and the particular desolation of a structure that has been abandoned by the people who should have cared for it. She thought about the notebook, the 2 columns on the first page. Materials. Priority. Written before she turned off the flashlight on the first night, in a sleeping bag on the floor of the smallest room with the best roof. She thought about Ruthanne saying, "Start there." 4.5 months. 137 days, give or take. From the parking lot where Frank had told her about the demolition order to this room, this light, this signed piece of paper in her hands. She folded the inspection report carefully and put it in her jacket pocket, where it settled next to the old iron key she still carried. She had not put the key down since she'd found it in her father's desk drawer. It had become the thing her hand found when it went into that pocket, familiar and particular, and hers now in a way it hadn't been when she'd taken it. She knew why she kept it, because it had been his, and now it was hers, and the line between those 2 things was the whole story. Ruthanne had mentioned the day before that Thomas had checked out of the inn, gone back to figure out what came next. Clara didn't ask where. She wrote back to Thomas that evening, not from the tower, from the kitchen, at the folding table, with the lamp on and the kettle going and the house quiet around her. She had been thinking about what to say for weeks. She had been turning the words over and waiting for them to land in an order that felt honest. She opened the laptop. She sat with the cursor blinking in the reply field for a moment. Then she wrote, "I know. I think he would have liked this house too. He would have spent 3 hours in the tower looking at the water and not said much about it. I'm not ready to pretend the last year didn't happen. I don't think you are either. But I don't think that means we have to be strangers. Come by sometime if you want. I'll show you what we've done with the place." She read it through once. Then she sent it. She closed the laptop and sat for a moment in the quiet. The house made the sound it made in the late evenings, a low, patient settling, like someone exhaling after a long day. She had learned to hear that sound as what it was. Not the building giving way. The building being still. There is a difference. January arrived the way January does on the Maine coast, cold and committed and bright in the particular hard way of winter light that has no warmth in it, but illuminates everything cleanly. The main room was finished. This had been December's final project, and she and Earl had come to the end of it on a Friday evening without ceremony. Earl fitting the last piece of trim around the south window, Clara refinishing the section of floor beneath it, both of them working in the companionable quiet that had become the texture of their days together. Earl had looked at the room when they were done, walked the perimeter once, pressed his hand against the wall where the new plaster met the old. "Good," he said, which was from Earl the equivalent of a standing ovation. He had gone home and Clara had sat in the finished room alone for a while, on the floor, because she still didn't have furniture worth mentioning, and looked at what 4.5 months of working on something had produced. Not a magazine version of a renovated house. A real one. Imperfect in the ways that real things are imperfect. which is to say imperfect in ways that show where the work was, and who did it, and why it was worth doing. She liked it better than a magazine version would have been. Patricia filed the lawsuit in the second week of January. The property rights case against the county's original demolition order procedure, citing the irregularities in the enforcement process and the documented financial conflict of interest in the adjacent property petition. It was not a simple case. Patricia had been clear about that it would take time. It might not succeed on every point. The legal landscape of county proceedings was not designed for speed. But Clara had approved the filing without hesitation, because it was about more than Harrow House. It was about the next property. The next person who got handed something that looked like a liability and was actually something else, and who then got handed a deadline and a man in a gray suit who sat outside their house 3 days in a row and waited for them to run out of runway. The case would create a record. Whatever happened, the record would exist. Other people could use it. That felt worth doing. That felt like the right use of the momentum that 4.5 months had built. Gus Harlan called her in the third week of January. Not official business. He said that clearly up front. Just calling to say the Preservation Board had received the full assessment report. The tower would be formally designated in February. He thought she should know ahead of the public announcement. "Thank you for expediting it," she said. "I looked at that stone," he said. 1778. Someone built that to stand. A pause. Seemed like the least I could do. She thanked him again and hung up and stood in the kitchen and thought about the specific texture of people who do the right thing without making you thank them for it. Then she went back to work. The day the formal designation arrived, she was in the tower. She was there most evenings now. It had stopped being deliberate and become simply what she did: work until the light went, go up to the tower, notebook. Sometimes just sitting with the lamp and the photograph of Helen Reed and the sound of the ocean doing its constant work beyond the east window. Patricia sent a text. The formal designation letter from the Maine Historic Preservation Board had arrived at her office. She photographed it and sent it through. Clara read it on her phone in the lamplight. Tower at Harrow House, Grayport, Maine. Formally designated under Maine Historic Preservation Statute. Construction confirmed 1778, pre-revolutionary. Protected in perpetuity. In perpetuity. She read it twice. She set the phone down on the table and looked at the room. At the curved walls and the narrow window and the shelf of books, and the chair and the cup that had sat on the edge of that table since 2008, as if any moment someone would be back for it. The tower had been here since 1778. 246 years. Through the revolution and everything that came after it. Through the storms that had taken ships off this coast and the winters that had taken people. Through 60 years of standing alone on the cliff before the main house was even built. Through Helen Reed's 17 years and the bricked-over door, and 15 years of abandonment, and 4.5 months of Clara and Earl with their tools and their 7:30 mornings and their quiet competence. Through Garrison and his gray suit and his patience that had finally run out in a parking lot in November. Through all of it. Still standing. She picked up the photograph of Helen Reed. Laughing. One hand on a doorframe. The light finding her. She set it back down. She thought about the long sequence of it. Roy Briggs building the wall course by course, because he'd made a promise and intended to keep it. Earl carrying the knowledge for 15 years and knowing when to let it go. Ruthanne, who had taught her what a house was for, and then called Earl on the right morning. Her grandfather, who had made a phone call in 1991 and said yes without conditions. A woman she would never meet who had saved money year by year in stacks, with the year written on each one, not knowing who would need it, trusting that someone would. All of those people doing the right thing without an audience, without a guarantee, because the thing was worth doing and the structure was worth keeping. And some things deserve to survive. She thought about her father at his kitchen table in the early morning silence. The newspaper, the coffee. The comfortable quiet of two people who don't need to fill a room to be present in it. He had known something about this house. Not everything, but something. Enough to write her name in the notation and mean it. She reached for the notebook. She opened it to the first page, the one from the first night. The 2-column list. Materials. Priority. The handwriting slightly cramped because she'd been writing in the dark with a flashlight propped against her shoulder. She turned forward through all of it. The measurements and the material costs and the questions she'd written down, because she didn't have anyone to ask yet. The page where she'd written what comes after no and started planning. The entry from the night she'd found the tin box, the handwriting less even than usual, running at a slight angle like her hand couldn't keep up with what she was thinking. The single sentence on the page after Gordon Reed's visit, "Some things get passed down the right way." She turned to the last blank page. She wrote the date at the top, January. She held the pencil and looked at the east window. Dark now, fully dark, winter dark that was absolute and complete. But she knew what was beyond it. The water moving. The horizon invisible but there. The distance, which was not the same as emptiness. She thought about what came next. Not the legal case, though that was part of it. Not the upstairs bedroom that still needed trim work, though that was also part of it. Not the south wall garden bed she'd been planning since October, or the front porch light fixture, or the dozen other things that were on the list, because a living house always has a list. She thought about what it meant to be the person who was here now. The person responsible for what happened to these walls. This stone. This east window, and the particular light it let in, and the particular view it offered of the particular stretch of ocean that Helen Reed had watched for 17 winters, and that her grandfather had decided was worth protecting, and that Roy Briggs had spent an afternoon in 2008 making sure would survive until the right time. The responsibility of it was not a weight. It had started that way, or something like it, in the parking lot in October when Frank had told her about the 8 months. But it had become something different over 4.5 months of being inside it. Something closer to purpose. The specific satisfaction of being the right person in the right place, doing the thing that the place requires. She started writing. Not a list, not a plan. Just what was there when she let herself be quiet enough to hear it. The lamp burned on the table. The photograph of Helen Reed sat at the corner, facing the window, facing the dark where the ocean moved and would keep moving long after anyone currently alive was here to watch it. The tower stood around her, old and dense and certain. 246 years of standing in exactly this spot, in exactly this way, built by someone in 1778 who had decided this cliff was worth building for and had proven it with the care of the work. Clara wrote, and the night deepened and the lamp held, and sometime after 10 she put down the pencil and sat back and looked at what she'd written. She read it once. Then she closed the notebook. She sat for a moment in the quiet room that smelled like stone and old wood and the faint salt of the ocean coming in through the small gaps that no old window is entirely without. The sounds of the house around her, the particular sound of Harrow House at rest, which she knew now the way she knew the sound of her own breathing. She turned off the lamp. She did not need the light to find her way in this house anymore. She knew where everything was.